Welcome back. I hope everybody's enjoying the coronavirus break. Today we're going to do a new lesson. This is the Unification of Italy. This is one of my favorite lessons. This and the Unification of Germany really do make up the core of the nationalism movement in the 1800s. And so this is going to be a lot of fun. You're going to see some war. You're going to see some deceit and deception. And it's almost like a big game of Risk in a lot of ways. So it's loads and loads of fun. The other thing about this that I really do like is that a lot of people don't realize that Italy really wasn't an independent country until 1860 and 1861. And that's really when their history kind of starts in the modern sense. Since the Roman Empire, Italy had been off and on conquered by multiple European powers. And so that's what we're going to get into today. So I hope you're ready for the unification of Italy. All right, so this map is immensely important because, quite frankly, it shows you all of the Italian city-states. And so I think it's really important to understand that Italy isn't one country, right? And in fact, these regions are very independent of one another. You know, if you look at the southern regions, right, the Kingdom of Two Sicilies, that's not even run by an Italian. In fact, the Kingdom of Two Sicilies is run by a Bourbon monarch, right? If you look at the Papal States, run more or less by the church, and then you go into the central Italy where you get a lot of independent city-states, Venetia. A lot of those city-states are going to be controlled by the Austrians. And Austria has a firm control over that northeastern Italy and part of that little central area as well. Now, the country that most of you have heard of, hopefully if you've done some reading, is the Kingdom of Sardinia, Piedmont. Sardinia, Piedmont. Which is Piedmont is in the mainland Italy to the west, and then Sardinia is this island in the lower left-hand corner. So Sardinia, Piedmont is a medium-sized country. They're not big by any stretch of the imagination. They're not overly wealthy, overly powerful, but that's actually where the unification is going to come from. It's not going to come from someplace like Rome, and that actually makes a lot of sense because Rome, really since the fall of the Roman Empire, even before the fall of the Roman Empire, Rome was not as powerful of a city-state as we often think. In fact, it was very poor. Its population had dwindled by a lot at that time. So I think that's something important to recognize. The other thing is that Italy is culturally divided. You have a lot of farmers. In particular, in the south, you see a lot of farmers located in the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies. Now, in the north, where Sardinia is and where Parma is, you start to see a lot more industry. That industrial revolution is starting to take fold. And by the 1850s, it really is. And we'll talk about that with Cavour as we kind of go forward. So important to kind of look at this map. And honestly, that's the reason I decided to do this lesson via PowerPoint, because I thought it was very important for you to actually see the maps. Because then you actually know where these things are and where we're actually going. And here we are. We have Mazzani and Garibaldi. Garibaldi's on your left, Mazzani's on your right. Now, these two titans of Italian culture, they're the guys who really push for independence. They're sons of the French Revolution in a lot of ways. They're born during the Napoleonic rule over Italy, and they grow up in this nationalistic fervor that Italy had been under. They both participate in the revolutions of 1848, though unsuccessfully, and they both fight in their own ways for Italian unification. Now, let's start with Mazzani, because I think Mazzani's really kind of cool to talk about. Now, if you look at Mazzani in this picture, right, he's wearing all black, and it's kind of an interesting fact. He said he wore all black because he was always in a state of mourning because the Italian people did not have a home. And so that's what he said. I will always be in black because I am mourning my people without a home. And Mazzani was very patriotic like that. He was very well spoken. He's a very good propagandist, right? He writes a lot of pamphlets. He writes a lot of literature dealing with that. He's going to form a group called the Young Italians. The Young Italians are essentially a group that wanted the unification of Italy, and it's young people who fight for it. Now, I know a couple guys in my class are probably going to start to call themselves that if we actually get back to school. But, you know, that's one of the things that he did. He created this youth movement for independence. Now, one of the things that Mazzani really wanted, though, it wasn't just about independence for Italy. It was about forming a republic. And Garibaldi and him are very similar in that. Garibaldi is not the political leader that Mazzani is. Instead, Garibaldi is the fighter. And he's going to fight in revolutions all throughout the early 1800s. He fights in revolutions in 1848. He leaves Italy for a time and goes to Central and South America and fights in revolutions there. So he is a revolutionary fighter. He believes in nationalism. Yes, he wants an independent Italy. But one of the things that he really wants is a republic. You see, because these guys aren't just nationalists, okay? They are also romanticists. right? They romanticize the past. And so what they do is they look at the Roman Empire, or the Roman Republic more likely. They would often say the greatest achievement of the Italian people was the Roman Republic. Right? And so they would often look at the Roman Republic as the ideal form. And we could talk all day about why that's probably not accurate, and because the Roman Republic clearly had a lot of flaws in it, but that's how they looked at it. They idolized the Roman Republic. And so that's their lifelong goal, both these guys. And sometimes they meet, sometimes they don't, but that's their big goal, right? It's to form a republic, an Italian republic that unifies all the people of Italy. Now, here's the other thing about these two guys. They're not going to get it done. They're not successful, and it's not because they're bad or they don't have, good ideas. They're not successful because they don't have money. They don't have finances. They don't have a bankroll. Okay. They don't have a country behind them, because Italy is impacted by other countries, right? You have France, who wants part of Italy. You have Spain controlling parts of Italy. You have the Austrians controlling parts of Italy. And so at different points in time, since the Renaissance, really, you've had Italy under the control of multiple foreign countries. And that's really hard to dispel. They can't beat the Austrians with just the young Italians. They're going to have to get some outside help. And that's just not going to happen for these guys. And that's ultimately why they're unsuccessful. However, they're going to play a large role. And remember what I just told you. It's going to be Sardinia, Piedmont that really comes forward to take the lead. And they're going to be led by a guy named Camillo Cavour. Now, Camillo is not the... He's not the epitome of what we think of when we think of a great nationalistic leader, right? I mean, because if you think about some of the people in Central America, or even, George Washington, if we're talking about U.S. history, George Washington's a tall guy. He looks the part. He talks the part. Everything he does kind of fits the part. Cavour is like the quiet guy, right? He's in the background. He's the guy, in the movie that when you're watching it, you don't realize that he's the real villain, but he is. And that's how it kind of goes with him. Emmanuel, Victor Emmanuel in Italy is the guy who, will become king, but Cavour is the guy who pulls the strings, okay? And Camillo Cavour is a brilliant guy. He is conservative, sort of. He doesn't really approve of universal voting. Sardinia, Piedmont, where he is going to be prime minister, the voting rights are 25 years old for men, and you have to be literate, and you have to pay a poll tax. So it excluded poor people and anyone who was illiterate, which was a decent amount of the population in Sardinia, Piedmont. And so really the adult male population did not have very many voting rights. It was kind of restricted to the elites, or to the nobility, if you will. So Cavour kind of believed in that. However, he is also very pragmatic, right? So if we think about him, it's a great comparison with him and Bismarck. He's an industrialist. Cavour understands that industry is going to play a large role in anything they have to come. And that's going to be part of his goals when he does take over Sardinia, Piedmont in 1851. He's going to start to push for some industrialization projects, and we'll talk about how he does that in a second. Now, the other thing we should probably mention about Cavour is pragmatism. And when we talk about pragmatism, we're also talking about realpolitik, right? That's that Q word that you kind of get in either AP Euro or AP World. And realpolitik and pragmatism essentially means that these guys, Bismarck and Cavour, they do not hold themselves to a political ideology, right? They're going to fix the problem however they see fit. Cavour's conservative, yet he also taxes the church in Sardinia, Piedmont. And that's something that a lot of people weren't doing at the time. So that's something to kind of keep in mind. Now, so how does he kind of unify the parts that he's in? Well, Sardinia, Piedmont unifies northern Italy through economics. And this is very similar to what Germany is going to do in our next lecture. So Sardinia, Piedmont couldn't afford to actually industrialize. So what they did is he went and traveled, and he went and met with the newly instituted Emperor of France, which is Napoleon III. He also went and met with England. And while he met with England and France, what he did was he reduced tariffs to almost nothing for Britain and France, and he allowed for them to have almost free economic trade in Sardinia, Piedmont. In exchange, British and French companies came in and built the railroad system for Sardinia, Piedmont, and they helped build factories. And so he used outside money to industrialize his own country, and not just his country. He started to build railroad tracks to unify part of northern Italy. And so you see a little bit of unity through trade, right? He wanted to create a triangle of power in northern Italy with the big cities that are there. And so they set a lot of trade up with that. And that's going to be one of the big things that kind of gets it done. However, it's not just going to be about that. We're going to have conflict for this thing to really get going. And Italy is full of conflict, right? You guys learned, I'm assuming anyone who's listening probably learned about the Renaissance, right? And Italy was always a war zone in the Renaissance. You had wars going on constantly, and it hasn't changed. There's always little revolts in Italy. All throughout the 1800s, ever since Napoleon left, there were tiny little guerrilla insurgencies led by guys like Garibaldi, right? Who wanted to have an Italian state, who wanted to have a Italy of their own. And all of these little revolts, they culminate in 1848 to a big movement. They actually take Rome in 1848. They declare themselves a Roman Republic, but it gets kind of picked apart by 4 other countries. And the Roman Republic dissipates after about 4.5 to 5 months. So it didn't actually work out too well. So it's funny because with all the revolts in Italy, you would imagine maybe a warlord kind of comes up and just takes over. No, it's actually going to be a war that's not even remotely close to Italy that's going to have the biggest say-so in Italian unification. And it's going to be a war located in the Ukraine between Russia and the Ottoman Empire. So the Crimean War is kind of the first really big war since Napoleon left town in 1815. The Crimean War is between the Ottoman Empire and the Russian Empire. Now, what a lot of people don't realize about Russia is actually kind of the big dog in Europe, because if you think about the Napoleonic Wars, Russia stops Napoleon. They stop him cold, literally, right, and figuratively. They stop him cold in his tracks, and they push him out of Russia, and they ultimately put forth a lot of soldiers. They occupy Paris for a long period of time, and so Russia is looked at as almost invulnerable because they have all this manpower, all this resources. However, Russia is not industrializing, which puts their military at a severe disadvantage. Now, the Ottomans also really hadn't, industrialized. In world history, we've talked about the Janissary Corps and how the Janissary Corps kind of refused to modernize past the 1750s. And so both sides are not using the most modern type weapons, and so they go for outsiders for help. And in this war, you got Britain and France, right, who are kind of looking at Russia saying, we don't like that you're that big. And so they're going to intercede in this, and they're going to actually go fight on behalf of the Ottoman Empire. They're going to put forth soldiers, money, and they're going to help fund and fight with the Ottoman Empire. Now, where does this get Sardinia, Piedmont in? Well, you got to first look at Austria, right? Austria in 1848 had a bunch of revolutions, and the Russians actually came in and helped put down some of these revolutions. So the Russians, a couple of years later, right, 1853, are like, hey, Austria, you going to come help us out? And Austria's like, nah, dude. Like, I got stuff to do. And they just didn't want to come. And so Austria is going to sit this war out. Now, France and Britain are like, hey, Austria, right? Russia's too big. They're on your border. Why don't you help us? And maybe, you can knock Russia down a little peg. And Austria's like, no, we don't really want to. We're going to sit this war out. We're just going to focus on us. And really, Austria did have a lot of me problems. They have, the whole Hungarian situation where they're trying to form a dual monarchy, and that'll eventually happen after the Austria-Prussian War. But they're kind of looking in that direction. So Piedmont then comes in. Camillo Cavour, who has met Napoleon III in France, and he's met the Prime Minister of England, and he is going to commit 15,000 soldiers and a large sum of money to fight in this cause. Mazzani actually was like, why would you do this? And he protested it, and they had protest marches in northern Italy over this, but he's going to send those soldiers over there. Now, what he knows is that Napoleon III is what we call a romantic ruler. He romanticizes these acts. So he looks at this as an act of valor. If tiny Piedmont can go stand up to big Russia, France should do the same. And more specifically, maybe we should help out Piedmont when they need it. And that's where Cavour is going to kind of get Napoleon hook, line, and sinker. He knew he needed help. He didn't know if it was going to be the British or the French, but the French were way, way easier because Napoleon III, like I said, is kind of manipulated. He's going to be manipulated in both these lessons, the German and the Italian. So, Cavour really does play the situation. Now, do countless, Piedmontine soldiers die? Yes, they do. They do suffer casualties, but it's all in the focus for him of getting that independence. So we've seen a military strategy that's a real politique going into a war you really shouldn't be in because it'll get you an alliance. And then we also see the economic side of things. So here, what we have is Napoleon, right? And then we have his buddy Cavour. Napoleon loves Cavour. He does. He thinks he's phenomenal. He's just one of these guys that Napoleon gets along with a lot. Napoleon views himself as a successor of Napoleon Bonaparte, and so he really wants to kind of make France a power. Now, Piedmont actually has territory that Napoleon wants. And so they do have territory that he's going to try and get, and he will actually get some of that territory, Nice and a couple of little places off to the west of Piedmont. Cavour, though, needs a war. He desperately needs a war. And, Napoleon will help him so long as, the Piedmontian soldiers don't just go invade. And so what happens is actually Austria plays right into their hands. Austria, dealing with a whole other problem in 1859 and 1860, is going to call for a draft of soldiers. And part of that draft is going to take place in the Italian city-states that they control. And Sardinia Piedmont says, hey, anyone who wants to desert from the Austrian army, don't serve. You can come to us. We'll take care of you. You can join our army or you can just live with us. And so they take on deserters. Now, Austria is really aggravated by this, and they're like, no, we're not going to let you take on our deserters, so you better give them back. And, Sardinia Piedmont's thinking like, all right, I got France behind me, so no. And, finally, he's going to go. Cavour's going to go to France to talk to Napoleon about this. And he's like, look, dude, we helped you out in the the war with the Russians. We need your help now. And this is the Austrians overstepping their boundaries. What's next? Where do they go next? Do they go to Western Germany? Do they go to your border? And Napoleon's kind of like, yeah, I kind of like this. But he's like, I really shouldn't do this. And then Britain kind of comes in, and Britain tries to secretly negotiate a peace treaty. Well, Cavour, being the ultimate kind of like manipulator, he also uses Mazzani in this as well. They're going to have a whole bunch of pamphlets get released about how this is a giant conspiracy to prevent Sardinia Piedmont from protecting Italians, and how it's a conspiracy against the French and the Italian people. And of course, this gets Napoleon really mad, and he says, you know what, we got your back. And the Austrians help Cavour out again by giving them an ultimatum, and then Napoleon says, forget your ultimatum, we're helping them out. And ultimately, this is going to be a very quick war where the French and the Piedmontian soldiers win. There's going to be some assistance from Prussia in this, by the way, as well. Prussia will help out the Sardinia Piedmonts against the Austrians, as well as a bunch of other German city-states. They all kind of attack Austria at once, and so Austria has to kind of, stop it, and they end up winning. And so that's the big deal. They get northern Italy off of this. And so Sardinia Piedmont will essentially conquer northern Italy, and they'll give up 2 small territories. And so in this one, you can kind of see the maps. They give up a series of territories, but now they control the northern Italian states. But they don't control southern Italy, okay, not yet. And so what they're going to have to do is they're going to have to invade southern Italy. And the way they're going to do that is they're going to use our boy Garibaldi. Garibaldi has formed an army, the Red Bandana Army, right? And it's 1,000 dudes, young Italians who want independence. Remember, Garibaldi wants to have this Italian state that's a republic. He wants to go at it. And so he's going to go through Sicily. And they're actually going to transport him to Sicily to do this. And so you think this is going to work out really well. Okay, Garibaldi wins a series of battles. Every town he goes to, more and more people join his army. It just builds and builds and builds and builds and builds, right? And so that's working out really, really well, except you get some lies here, right? Piedmont is sitting there, and Cavour's like, we need to unify Italy. And if he takes over southern Italy, he's going to attack us. So he's going to cut him off. He moves Piedmont's armies to Rome. And he tells the Pope, we will protect you, because he was going to go liberate the Papal States, Garibaldi was. He says, we'll protect you against this so long as you submit to us, right? And they allow the Papal States to remain semi-independent, but they're going to submit to the Italians. Now, for Garibaldi, this presents a huge obstacle. What do you do if you're him? Do you sit there? Do you give up? Do you kind of go forward? Do you attack the Piedmontians and then maybe Austria gets in? That's the big play. And ultimately, he has to make a very difficult decision. Very, very difficult decision. And ultimately, that decision is going to be nationalism, right, over liberalism, right? Nationalism over a republic. And so Garibaldi has fought his whole life for these 2 things, an independent Italy and a republic. And he tries to negotiate, and Cavour's like, nah, dude, it's not going to be some universal republic. There's going to be voting rights, but it's going to be the Piedmontian-style voting rights. They allow certain regions to kind of remain the same. And so this political cartoon is actually very famous. It's Garibaldi kind of bending the knee, if we're going Game of Thrones references, and he's giving the boot, the Italian peninsula. He's giving that to Victor Emmanuel. Victor Emmanuel is going to be named King of Italy a year later in 1861. And actually 5 years later, in 1866, 65 and 66, they get Venetia. They get it because actually Austria fights a war with Prussia, and Italy kind of declares war and gets that territory from it while Austria is weak. Like I said, Austria is like just getting beaten up this entire time. So the question that I kind of leave with you, and this will be how we end it, is, was it worth it, right? Was it worth it for Garibaldi? Your lifelong goal is to have a republic and a nation. Is it worth giving up the republic for the nation, or should he have fought for these republic ideas that are so very important for him and the people of Italy? Because the reality is, Italy was not unified after this. You had a lot of cultural dissonance. You had a lot of people who did not like the fact they couldn't vote, that they didn't have a large parliament, and that it was mostly dominated by northern Italy. You had a north versus south kind of mantra where the south was heavily farmed and the north was industrialized. You had a lot of disunity, and it created a lot of problems for the next 20 years. And so the question is, should Garibaldi have kind of gone forward with this, or should he have given up? I'll let you think about that. You can put it in comments, or if you're in my class, you're going to be answering some questions on it anyway. Thank you.